What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson, here with my co-hosts, Julia Gledhill and Matt Duss. How are y'all doing?
What's up, friends?
Doing all right.
Yeah.
Everything's amazing. I'm going to keep saying that.
Of course.
It's true.
The end of the world is amazing in a certain way. So, Matt, you just got back from Taiwan.
Yes.
What was the deal there?
Did
you come back and forth without incident, first of all?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yes. I was wondering about that, but yeah, the global entry is smooth and Orwellian when you look into the camera and they just wave you through. It's convenient, but it is chilling every single time.
So true.
You've got, as some listeners, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, having won the presidency for the third term in a row, new President Lai, not very interested in cross-strait engagement. It's interesting.
Fairly hawkish for being the equivalent of the Democratic Party.
Well, that's interesting.
Although now that I say that,
no, that's so funny because I said that exact same thing. I was like, it's kind of disconcerting that you have this socially progressive, pro-gay rights, pro-equality party that's also kind of hawkish and militarist, like the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
right.
Yes. So they are, in fact, unfortunately, very much like the Democratic Party,
yeah.
Or at least the way the Democratic Party has been trending. But it's this interesting, historically, because you have the KMT, the Kuomintang, the founding nationalist party of Taiwan, which fought the Chinese Civil War against the Communist Party. But the KMT is actually the party that has, cross-strait engagement, that is engaged and willing to talk with the CCP, and which, continues with at least the pretense that there is one China and they should be ruling it. Even if that is just a thin pretense, but at least they adhere to that principle of one China, and at some point in the future, all of China will be reunited. Details to be worked out later. You cannot yada 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 those details. They are, of course, very, very important. Whereas the DPP, is careful in the way it asserts independence and sovereignty, but it still very much represents view among many people in Taiwan, a majority, in fact, given that they have won the presidency, so 3 times in a row now, that feels that Taiwan should be separate, that is very proud, rightly, of the way that Taiwan has developed a real democracy over the past few decades since the early 90s. But interestingly, even some of the more pro-independence, liberal and progressive people we spoke to would acknowledge, right now, there's just no pathway to actually achieving that. The reality is that China is enormously powerful. We continue in an unsatisfying status quo and hope something happens.
Did they mention anything about how, either concerns or hopes they have about the new Trump era?
Yeah, concerns probably more than hopes. But unsurprisingly, people try to be, to be chill about it. When you go, we're talking to this group of Americans, we don't want to come in and be alarmist, but it's clear, and it was notable to me how many people made reference, some direct and some just kind of offhand, about having cards, which references that comment that Trump made to Zelensky: "You have no cards." In the White House meeting, in that Oval Office meeting. And so, as we saw, for example, the announcement of, the new TSMC facilities in Arizona, and Lai announcing we're upping our defense budget, we're committing to these new, resilience measures.
The TSMC, there's some progressive forces in Taiwan who are really ambivalent about the TSMC factory building in the U.S. precisely because the MAGA intellectual foreign policy types like Bridge, Colby, they have been very clear. Even J.D. Vance was like, look, if we can get Taiwanese semiconductors manufactured in the U.S., then we don't have to worry about if China or when China invades. It was like taking America's sort of stake out of it in a very stupid and counterproductive way. But it's if you're Taiwan, that's your Silicon Shield or whatever.
Right,
And
that's
by
what they call it.
Yeah, but like for that to work, you gotta maintain sort of positive control
Right.
over manufacturing on the front
Yeah.
line in a way. Like there's a dilemma there that I feel like they're not reckoning with.
Right. No, I think there is a dilemma, and I think people recognize it. For the time being, the small number of fabs that they are building here in the United States do not undermine that principle.
It's not insufficient in
any
scope.
meaning. Yeah. You know, Trump has made clear how transactional he is, how his whole view of U.S. foreign policy and the U.S.-led order is that you need to pay upstairs to the boss. And so they are interested in demonstrating, as a lot of American partners and clients are interested in demonstrating, that we are contributors to American security and prosperity instead of just consumers of it. You know, and I think that's the kind of mentality that demonstrates.
Well, glad you're back. So I did an episode a couple days ago, and I introduced the sort of Wikipedia level of this Signal chat Houthi war plan leak, Hegseth drunken targeting, whatever, Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic, all of those keywords that have become like the news story of the decade. I sort of started talking about that already a couple days ago, but what do you guys, put you on wax? What do you guys make of this? There's like 20 different ways to critique what's going on here. So what are your entry points? What are the things that are like jumping out at you as the most concerning or the most laughable?
Why don't you take the first crack there? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the United States has been involved in heavy quotation here, counterterrorism operations in Yemen for the majority of my life, arguably, back to like 2000, 2009.
Bombing Houthis is not new, yeah.
Right. And what I found really striking is obviously, you know, the fact that we're continuing to bomb the Houthis is more important than the group chat shenanigans. But what was so stunning to me is in the press release that the DoD released yesterday, they say, you know, we are, you know, showing American resolve and sort of compensating for, what do they say, Biden's, you know, pinprick approach to combating the Houthis. And they say, you know, they undesignated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. They pursued smaller scale strikes. I don't know if that's actually true. And so we are, you know, showing American resolve, blah, 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 yada, yada, the usual lines. And it's like, they're doing the same exact thing as the Biden administration. And the kind of distinctions that they're attempting to draw are so minute in the grand scheme of things that it's really just the mental gymnastics of it all was wild. The other thing that really struck me about it in the reporting that we saw from the Atlantic is, and it could be just me here, but it seemed to me like the reasoning for not publishing all of the text messages at the beginning was a cited concern for the safety of US service members. But then the Atlantic publishes those text messages 2 days later and simultaneously questions Press Secretary Leavitt's argument that releasing the information would jeopardize national security. And that struck me as a contradiction in the reasoning behind withholding the text in the first place. But I'm curious if you'll agree.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions all over the place from the Biden administration and from the Atlantic, from Jeffrey Goldberg. And I mean, let's note, I mean, I'm just going to say this, like the idea that Jeffrey Goldberg is a hero in this story is a problem. No. There are, in my view, few journalists
John Bolton of publishing
who are more responsible,
you know what I mean?
For the shitty, stupid state of our foreign policy discussions than Jeffrey Goldberg. So, you know, whatever one thinks of how he acted here, admirably or not, I think it's fine. I have some of the same questions of what he chose to withhold and not. I mean, the idea that Jeffrey Goldberg is a hero is not one I subscribe to. But yeah, that's right. I think it was, you know, and let's recognize he supports bombing the Houthis, right? Yeah. He is a fan of the national security state. He is a fan of the war on terror. He is a total hawk. He is 100% behind all this stuff, completely uninterested in asking any questions of what is actually going on here. I mean, you look at the first article he wrote, and like he's like, it's important to know some history. starting after October 7th, the Houthis, an Iran-backed terror organization that hates Americans and Jews, started attacking Israel. It's like, really? Is that the history we need to know?
Wow.
It begins on October 7th. It's like, that is the most perfect example of our stupid foreign policy discussions here in Washington. It's fun to read the texts and their stupid little emojis like fist, American flag, fire, high schoolers,
the level of discourse, the level of intellect
Yeah.
that leads to these choices is like stunningly cavemanish.
No,
I mean,
no, really. And that's just the one thing they talk about. Oh yeah, we hit this one guy as he was going into his girlfriend's apartment building. We took it down. You leveled a fucking apartment building to kill one guy. Fist bump, American flag, fire emoji. That's like
that's
the
war
level
crimes.
of care and
That's
seriousness
a confession of war crimes.
Right. That's exactly right. But still, the bigger question is, why is the Trump administration, like the Biden administration before it, waging an undeclared war against the region's poorest country rather than reining in our extremely prosperous and powerful client states' mass atrocities? Because that's what their attacks on shipping are, a form of protest against the Gaza war. And when there was a ceasefire, those attacks have stopped.
Genocide threatens freedom of navigation. Genocide threatens commercial shipping. The Houthis are just bad instruments that make that causal loop go, And this, to me, we're all progressive foreign policy heads on this show. Like, the thing that I try to explain to people that's often lost is like, progressive foreign policy is not about like draping yourself in values. It's about getting at and trying to identify the root causes of insecurity.
Yeah.
And it's like the parallels between this case and like bin Laden and 9/11, this is where it makes the difference, because it's like US bases in Saudi Arabia were bin Laden's animating grievance. And if we could have pulled those out, 9/11 probably doesn't happen. That's progressive foreign policy. The solution is not bullets or 20 years of war on terror. It's get the fucking bases out of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
That doesn't mean we're like siding with bin Laden, but he's again an agent of the causal loop. That and so if you actually want to prevent these problems, you've got to redress the underlying issues. Same here.
Yeah. The United States will do literally anything except for address the root cause of conflict with the Houthis, even doubling down on a failed leadership decapitation strategy, which we've done for literal decades.
Yeah.
For what? For backlash?
Right. I mean, ask the Saudis and the Emiratis how bombing the shit out of Yemen works as a strategy. And then, and the argument, of course, and it's unfalsifiable. It's like, well, you just didn't do that enough. That's why you have this as in that text chain, just this nonsense term, restoring deterrence. I mean, it's always like, how many times do you have to restore deterrence before you realize you're not actually doing that, right? You bomb the crap out of something and then you have to do it again.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Not to distract from all of this, but like the part that I found sort of most, I guess, revealing or bias confirming was the absolute antipathy toward Europe, which I sort of explained this in the last episode, but like my read on like the MAGA JD Vance obsession with sticking it to Europe, even though they're white, is precisely that Europe is run in their minds by a bunch of lib cucks. And that's the stronghold for, wokeness and like cosmopolitanism, which they do see as a threat. He like stressed all this cradle of civilization shit because he wants to have the US and Europe be that sort of white nationalist bloc, but only once the equivalent of the AfD in Germany takes over all the European countries. And so for now, they like literally want to subvert the reigning governments, because the reigning governments are a bunch of woke libs in their mind.
It's interesting because you look at, it's unclear. I mean, these things are like JD Vance and Pete Hegseth. Those are the names of the principals, but people chiming in for them are their aides. And it's unclear how long that continued or peak, But so Andy Baker, who's JD Vance's, chief foreign policy advisor, he was the one, at least in the early, I don't know if he kept on, being the one to speak for, or to text, I guess, for Vance, but he was the one to voice caution. Of course, he voiced caution because he thought we were continuing to carry Europe's water. But I read that, I'm like, okay, well, at least Andy Baker is the one who was like, is this the right thing to do? Whether or not I disagree with him or agree with him on whether, his reasoning behind why we should or shouldn't be doing it.
No, the non-intervention arguments that Vance or his proxy were making were reasonable points on their own terms. It's just fucked because the presumption that bombing is any kind of solution is so embedded. It's like an unchallengeable assumption in their minds, and that's like part of the problem here.
Yeah, no one was questioning that basic logic.
Yeah, someone's got to bomb them. Okay, well, just real quick, I got a 15-second clip of how fucking Fox News is running interference about all this.
It's like Goldberg will sometimes send out fake names with a contact with their cells to deceive politicians. Wall says Elon and Big Balls are on the case. This wouldn't surprise me if Goldberg sneaked his way in.
They called him Goldbergle and said he's the lowest of the low. They're putting all of this on Jeffrey Goldberg, who, again, we're not defending Jeffrey Goldberg, but
that's Jesse Waters. I think, I forget who referred to him as this, but he's like, Axe body spray in human form, but I mean, just one of the most ridiculous people on Fox News, and that is saying something. It's like, no, I think when they got rid of Bill O'Reilly, they looked for like the nearest mediocre white man, and he was just kind of like lying there in a corner. And they were like,
mission accomplished.
Yeah, mission accomplished. But no, there's no way around it. It's like Waltz had Jeffrey Goldberg's number because Waltz leaks to Jeffrey Goldberg.
The level of like in-your-face flagrant lying is very concerning, actually. Like it's hilarious, but like words don't even matter. Like they just say whatever they want, total full frontal denial, and like they're not like there's no cost for them to just do such like in-your-face lying. That's really rough.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a testament to how far you can get if you deliver the right way in Washington. People will say whatever, but if you have the right airs about you, you can get really far.
We've had 2 days of hearings now, Senate and House side, on this scandal. How many hearings did we have over the past 17 months about the war in Gaza? I mean, what this city chooses to be outraged about and what Congress chooses to actually, exert oversight on is just it's crazy, man.
Yeah, the congressional impotence is so striking, especially on the war power stuff and in this context. It's like it's almost in the same vein of getting really upset about civility and, respect in terms of discourse. Obviously, you want to treat others with human dignity and respect, but the types of things that get people really riled up is, I think, really convenient for lawmakers who, again, don't want to do their jobs.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, the founding fathers could not have imagined Congress ceding power the way it has. Like, just they're not defending their own source of power. It's all outsourced to special interests and mostly to the imperial presidency. There was one thing that I didn't put in our checklist of stuff for the show because Tulsi Gabbard was up on the Hill doing the national annual threat assessment for ODNI, and it's a bunch of normal, like it's basically like the annual threat assessment of ODNI is like, let's check in on what the national security state as an interest group thinks is important and what colors their imagination. And so the top line threat is still great power competition in China. And that's what keeps the dollars of the defense industry flowing, little stuff in there about Russia, which is like kind of the intelligence community's low-key dig at the Trump administration, a huge elevation of fentanyl and drug trafficking and cartels, right, compared to previous years. But then very quickly they were asked, or Tulsi Gabbard was asked about fentanyl coming from Canada because that's Trump's excuse on the tariffs, right? And she had this to say.
Is the IC wrong in its omission of Canada as a source of illicit fentanyl in the ATA? I was surprised, given some of the rhetoric, that there is no mention of Canada in the ATA.
Senator, the focus in my opening and the ATA was really to focus on the most extreme threats in that area. And our assessment is that the most extreme threat related to fentanyl continues to come from and through Mexico.
So the president has stated that the fentanyl coming through Canada is massive, and actually said it was an unusual and extraordinary threat. And that was the language that was used to justify putting tariffs on Canada. I'm just trying to reconcile those two issues. Is it an unusual
Help me understand
threat, or is it a minor threat that doesn't even merit mention in the annual threat assessment?
Senator, I don't have the numbers related to Canada in front of me at this time. I'd like to get back.
Senator, sometimes the president just says shit. That's just what he does.
Tulsi Gabbard is great at saying, I don't know, in 1,000 different ways.
No, I gotta say, like, what do you do there?
This is like the Daily Show in the Jon Stewart days, where it's like, you think that if you can gotcha them with facts, that it will change something.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
And then you go, oh, that's how you do political change. It turns out it is not.
Yeah. Julia, did you have a piece about the National Security Council that you were going to share? That was like tied to
yeah, I actually forgot to mention that. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, so okay, the reason I flagged it in the group chat is because our much lower stakes group chat is because
also on Signal.
Also
everything happens on Signal now.
That's true. No, so my colleagues had, I think, a unique perspective on Signalgate. They wrote a piece in the National Interest and basically argued that, look, obviously mistakes were made, but this mess up on the part of the administration poses real questions about the role of the National Security Council in the policymaking process. So they give a really good historical context to the establishment of the National Security Council, which was created through the National Security Act of 1947. And even at the time, the establishment of the NSC was pretty controversial, as was a lot of things at that time when they were unifying the armed services. But they basically argue that, the National Security Council scope is too broad and that we should scale it back and really use it more as a venue through which department heads can share information. And I thought it was just a really good perspective on how the Signal debacle is emblematic of sort of greater issues in the way that we do foreign policy. I mean, pick your example. The NSC has a pretty rich history of fucking up the world. There's a really good book on like Henry Kissinger's era, White House warriors, which is where I first learned about
John Gans, right?
Yes. Learned about
the other John Gans. There are two John Gans now. So.
That's right.
Sorry to interrupt.
But the power of the NSC is really difficult to overstate, and it's, in my view, kind of a like shadow governance structure in foreign policy making. And it's a really good piece by Evan Cooper and Lucas Ruiz, so I would definitely recommend it. But it was something that I have not seen written about a whole lot, in particular the context of this Signal fiasco, and something that I think we should all consider. I don't see the prospects for reform being very optimistic in this administration. One thing that they mentioned in the piece is that at the beginning of the Trump administration, the president issued a memorandum that at first glance looks like it might sort of give a bit more power back to the departments who, again, like go through confirmation hearings and all of that. But really what it did was sort of downsize the NSC in service of this greater project to, make it less accountable and again, this kind of shadow governance structure, policymaking structure. And so, yeah, there's just like, there's no oversight of the National
Yeah.
Security Council. And that's something we should all be very concerned about.
Right, and that I'm glad you brought that up because that's also like one of the problems with Signal is like, Waltz has disappearing messages that these is important records for the American public.
That's also illegal. Yes,
That
like
is also illegal. It is patently illegal.
deleting records is
Yeah, right, exactly. Deleting records of a strike that killed, lots of human beings on questionable legal authority, to say the very, very least.
Yeah, I would say that like there is no restructuring of the NSC that will save us. Like,
Right.
and even like if you spin authorities down to the individual departments, it's Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, you bring it
You're
back to the
saying there's-
principles and they still make bad decisions. In the same way that you give Congress their war powers. I mean, that's the same thing we've seen with like congressional war powers. Like, people are afraid to bring AUMF repeal to a vote because a lot of people are going to make the wrong decision because they've been brainwashed into thinking that these foreign policy decisions are good and justified. But in fact, doing nothing is often the best thing to do. Whether that be not supporting Israel in a plausible genocide, right, of 50,000+ people, many of them children, but also in, what's happening in the Red Sea. Like, you address the root issue and you don't have to deal with the second order effects.
Right.
yeah.
That's why the only answer is to elect a president who's genuinely committed to tearing this down.
Yep.
This, I mean, all these structures of the national security state that have been built to insulate it from actual democratic accountability.
Yeah. I mean,
I
the
know-
national security. So Arnold Wolfers was like this realist scholar in the 1950s, like one of the earliest OG guys. And they were trying to define what like national security was at the beginning of the Cold War, or like what it should be. And he had this famous article called like National Security as an Ambiguous Symbol. And basically he was like, look, national security, it's supposed to be about survival, but 99.9% of the time, it has nothing really to do with survival. And most of the actions that we do kind of threaten our survival. So like what national security is about in practice is, his phrase was milieu goals. And milieu goals are all about like status and wealth hoarding and power position and this kind of nonsense. And it's like, and then it gets sanitized as national security. And like, that's not, he's like, it's up to democratically elected politicians to determine whether that's legitimate. But that's, of course, a broken ass process. And so like, if you're counting on like Trump to be the determiner of whether milieu goals are worth $1 trillion and 5 million dead people, like that's insane. That's insane. So like the entire national security apparatus is insane, which is why the most urgent task is to bridle the national security state and also fight oligarchy. And those things go together.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, no, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of becoming a sycophant of the national security state because you get the status and the power and the headlines and the bylines. And it's really appealing. If you're a true careerist, that's what you would do. But actually, something you said kind of reminded me of something I've kind of been struggling with. The sort of Hegseth cuts is, or not cuts, but sort of reshuffling of the Pentagon budget is, a lot of the climate related stuff. You can see that they're still funding programs to fortify military establishments and, infrastructure from climate related events. So they know that the threat is real. But at the same time, I'm not in theory opposed to the idea of DOD not doing climate related stuff because I don't think that they're the right venue for that. And I think that that is a testament to the national security-ification of everything, which is if it's not the national interest, then it's national security. And that applies to climate too. And it's very easy to, again, fall in that trap of sort of inadvertently protecting the national security state by trying to get what you want through the national security state. And in this case, that would be climate related funding. So as far as DOD, protecting military establishments from
DOD doesn't do climate stuff. What it does is, like you said, like sandbagging bases against floods and like, and
property protection.
Yeah, that's basically it. And then sometimes it heightens the imagination of like how to think about doing war, because you imagine this like, the world is a fucking barrio and you're supposed to patrol it and contain the chaos that climate change unleashes on the global south or whatever. But that's it. Otherwise, they don't do climate change.
That's unfair. I mean, sometimes these forward bases in these secret wars that we know nothing about are powered by solar generators. So let's,
EV tanks,
like electric tanks or something.
Let's acknowledge that, okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely overblown, the climate related research, whatever stuff that they're doing. But in theory, like, no, they shouldn't be doing that. That's not their scope. That's not their mission. But yeah, it's all about protecting military establishments, and that's literally it.
Yeah. No, a friend of mine was the original, in the Obama years, literal person who convinced the Secretary of Defense to basically do a climate strategy, the Pentagon's first ever climate strategy. And it was a bunch of horse shit. It was just words.
Didn't they call it global change too? I remember researching this in college, and I couldn't find climate change anywhere because, of course, they don't acknowledge that it's anthropogenic, that it's caused by humans. And they called it global change, as is, like we're moving into a new geological era. And I was like, what? So even Obama was saying that, oh, this is just global change in the weather.
But like he was a skinny jeans, avocado toast eating hipster guy who just happened to exist in the Pentagon in that era. And he was a political appointee, so he had kind of free reign to, pick his job or whatever. And then he was a good salesman. And so he sold the national security state effectively on like internalizing the climate change hotness, if you will. And the result was like, oh, DOD's getting woke on climate. And like he helped basically create a whole narrative that now is the very thing that Hegseth has demonized and is weaponizing and pretending to go to war against. But it never achieved anything to begin with, And so whatever. Ultimately, though, you have a piece, I guess, in Responsible Statecraft. Was that right?
Yeah.
About the fakeness of the cuts.
Yeah, I felt like I had to say something because he did this very self-indulgent video that he published on Twitter last week to announce—
Who, abuser Hegseth?
Hegseth, indeed, yes. On $580 million in Pentagon contracts, programs, grants that he canceled. And it's just— my point, the argument that I make in the piece is that we do not need like a 3-minute video of you announcing $580 million in so-called cuts, because your actual plan is to redirect those funds to other parts of the Pentagon budget. So we don't need you to appeal performatively to taxpayers as if you're getting rid of waste in the Pentagon, when in fact you are reshuffling so that we can do Golden Dome for America, nuclear modernization, and like bullshit. It's so annoying. It's so annoying. And he's such a talking head. He is unfortunately very good at it in terms of appealing to people, but it's active deception. They are not top-line Pentagon budget cuts. That would actually require the administration to have some gumption and stand up to industry. And instead of doing that, they are doubling down on things like nuclear expansion, building weapons that we do not need for an egregious amount of money. We are mortgaging our futures on this stuff. So yeah, I just had to say something because I'm so sick of seeing Hegseth, Doge care about cutting Pentagon waste. No, they don't. No, they don't. They're not cutting anything. They are not supporting top-line cuts to the Pentagon budget. The administration is supporting hundreds of billions of dollars of increases to military spending through reconciliation. And their fiscal year 2026 budget request to Congress is going to be really depressing. So I don't know. I think like the media fiasco around the Washington Post news with the initial headline that Hegseth was going to cut around $50 billion from the budget annually every year for 5 years. And then the next day, the Washington Post said, oh, he clarified they're actually reshuffling the budget.
Absolutely not going to happen.
Yeah, not going to happen. No way. He's obviously not going to cut the top line. And, that was a difficult story to report. And I do think that the administration is intentionally deceptive. But to continue publishing videos talking straight to the taxpayer as if you're actually cutting anything from the Pentagon budget, much less returning money to their pockets, it is so frustrating.
I have a couple, I wouldn't say they're friends, but people I knew from a former life who are like social media connected to me still. And they're executives at some of the big five, like the old defense contractors, if you will. And they are very bullish about their prospects and their bottom line in the Trump 2.0 years. So that tells you everything you need to know. Like they're on the inside, they're going to get what they want and more. Golden Dome, F-47, which we'll get to. It's all just fucking grift. The national security stuff going on in this era, it's weirdly reminiscent of like the Reagan national security years, which by the way, doubled the defense budget.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it followed stagflation, right? Reagan used the military buildup to artificially pump up the economy. We're doing the same thing. It's the same shit. He gets to lean on this manufacturing line, right? That we're somehow increasing our productive capacity by spending all this money. And it's like, is it productive if you're investing in military infrastructure? No,
is it though? Isn't.
Is it though? And like, are contractors even going to be successful? No. So yeah, it's loaded.
This is one of the things that scares me though about like the UK right now is leading among Europeans in like unleashing a dramatic upsurge of defense spending. The way that they're selling it is like literally like the Labour UK defense secretary was like, look, $1.6 billion contract for equipment and shit. That $1.6 billion contract is a jobs stimulus. And in their own press release, they say that $1.6 billion, I say dollars, it's pounds, but 1.6 billion pounds spending contract for stimulus of jobs, it creates 1,600 jobs. They say that's what is that? 10 million, $100 million a job? I think $10 million a job. I'm not good at math, but like, are you fucking kidding? Those are some amazing jobs. Military Keynesianism is.
But you're not accounting for all the money that's being skimmed here. I mean, that's important too, right?
What are the dark jobs being created by this?
Right. How many pools and yachts and third vacation homes? Yeah.
Yeah. So like for America, there's a way in which military Keynesianism functions as a kind of original sin where it's like, this is what fucked over America's labor movement. We have a weak labor movement because of this, we have a militarized police force because of this. We have a militarized foreign policy because of this. And then ultimately all of that leads to like the far right takeover of democracy in this country. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, that's the ultimate consequence of doing this kind of like national security as welfare policy. You know what I mean? And so like, and Europe's going down that path. Yeah. Europe is responding to the Trump moment by just like doing chest thumping hawkery. And it's like, this is dangerous, No,
I mean, I think it could go to a dangerous place. There's no doubt. I mean, everything you said about the impact on our society, our politics, labor movement, powering, oligarchy, corporate America, the military industrial complex. True. I do, I might be in a small minority on our side on this, but I do think there is potentially some value in Europe getting more serious and investing a bit more in its own manufacturing and defense capacity, if only to detach itself from the United States' military industrial complex. Now,
that's the dilemma is like, right. How do you create like more autonomy for yourself without just feeding into militarism? And the key there is actually to have a fucking strategy, not just to be like vibing out.
I think that's right. I think that's right. But I think it's very clear how our worst, some of the US's worst impulses are something that Europeans could potentially push back on.
No, I totally agree. I mean, obviously it comes down to like the capacity of individual countries and like what they're willing to what opportunity cost they're willing to assume. But another point on the like doubling down on military Keynesianism in the United States is that there's also an argument to be made that spending more on the military obviously impacts our future economic vitality, resilience, however you want to put it. It can also have a it can also exacerbate inflation because by that same logic, if you are investing your money in military industrial infrastructure at the cost of civilian infrastructure and procedural investment in efficiencies and, production, then prices are going to go up. Like that's a problem. So, counterintuitively, like to the Trump administration, perhaps like this is obviously an opportunity cost. I think most people could see that. And it's also going to exacerbate, arguably like one of the biggest economic issues that the Trump administration is already, making worse through their economic policies and tariffs and all those things. So thinking about like resiliency long term, it's super clear why this is a bad idea. And still it's like the same line continuity from the Biden administration as far as building up industrial support so that we can do warfare with China. And of course, like again, they're doubling down on exquisite systems while saying that, oh, we need attributable weapons, whatever, for a war with China. It's like, okay, then why are we doing the F-47? How does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, the thing with Europe too is like spending on the military has to be paired with relative austeritization. And if you austeritize your society, you create the far right. Like that couldn't be a clearer historical causal line. And so if in the name of independence, you shift domestic spending away from welfare into the military, you just fucked it all. You just strengthened the far right. You've cucked yourselves. Like this is not okay. So like that, and nobody's acknowledging that. And this is part of the Trump, like Trump doesn't have a plan, but like this is part of the larger MAGA national conservative plan. Like this is a kind of accelerationism. You want European nations to find their internationalism and then take it to its logical conclusion, because all of this unleashes that far rightization process. You can make everybody a bunch of fucking fascists and white nationalists, You totally gut social democracy by going down this path. So the only way you can guard against that is by at least being conscious of that. And I just don't see anybody even being conscious of that. Like we're on this accelerationist path. Speaking of manufacturing, there was a CNN story. This is going to be a slight pivot. that BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle maker, BYDs are all over New Zealand, by the way. Like they Uber and stuff. Like I've ridden in them. They're very nice. But they're like extremely inexpensive EVs. They're kind of like low-end Teslas. And the revenue from 2024 that BYD had was $107 billion, which is now higher than Tesla's. And so BYD also sold 2.3 times as many cars as Tesla last year. And so wow. BYD is basically like doing the job of EV manufacturing and sales more, better, cheaper than anybody else. And of course, the US EV industry, which is already not competitive, is kind of going in the opposite direction. My brother lives in Baltimore, actually. He's trying to buy a car right now. And he says, like, especially with interest rates, they're like impossibly expensive. And EVs is not even in the conversation because that's like 2 levels up in terms of cost, And so the US consumer needs, but is not getting affordable EVs, which BYD is the one, But like, even if you don't care about the consumer, and the Trump administration obviously doesn't, like strategically, US industry is in trouble here. Right. And it's partly a result of trying to like firewall off Chinese IP, Chinese innovation, Chinese comparative advantages. And so if the U.S. wants to be competitive in like future-oriented industries like EVs, it's going to have to partner with Chinese firms, not contain them. We're going the opposite fucking way, and that's ultimately like accelerating our own decline here. And it's not clear that Chinese firms would even want to partner with us at this point because of the context we've helped shape.
That was my question. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm BYD, I'm probably not interested in the like political risk of being in the U.S. market, So, but we could fix that. We could like turn it around and be like, hey, actually, we were just kidding, or like it was all Biden. We could do that. It's like, put it on Biden.
I mean, at some point, we're gonna reach a point where we're in a rock or a hard place, right? Like we're gonna have to grovel because at some point we have to have accessible EVs. I don't know when that time is, but it's like I don't think that it's a question of if it's going to happen, right? And it's gonna, everything that happens now is going to undercut future efforts to make accessible this type of technology, whether it's EVs or something else, to the American public for the benefit of the globe.
Yeah. Last thing, we have a by the numbers, I think, Julia.
Yeah. Yes.
$20 billion.
Okay. Yeah, $20 billion.
Wait, you're supposed to say it, I guess, but
yes. So this is my figure for by the numbers this week, because that is the value of the contract that the Air Force recently awarded to Boeing to produce the F-47 fighter jet, which I mentioned earlier. Yes, it's named after Trump, much to the chagrin of Lockheed Martin. They fought out Boeing for this contract. So why does this matter? The F-47 is supposed to replace the F-22 Raptor fighter jet in the air dominance role. So different from the F-35, which is also a fifth generation fighter jet, but multi-role, which is kind of the original sin with that program. And the reason it is like the most expensive acquisition program in US history, not like it is. The strategic justification for the F-47 is, of course, potential war with China. So there's one reason of several to be skeptical of this program, not least among them Boeing's track record in both the military and the commercial realms.
Yes.
Flying blind,
yes.
Everybody should read it. The F-47 is also a super secretive and expensive program that the Air Force actually paused at one point last year at the behest of former Secretary Frank Kendall, because the unit cost of the program was estimated to be nearly $300 million, which is in fact more than almost three times the cost of one F-35, fifth generation fighter jet. And so Trump
we don't need this shit. We don't need this. For what?
But Trump is F-47. He's so excited about it.
I'm sure.
We really don't need it. It's part of this like next generation air dominance program. The other part of NGAD is the drone part. So the idea is that the F-47 will fight alongside drones in a war with China. So
it's just that's just a Christmas tree of like adding shit.
I'm gonna need to withhold judgment on the F-47 until I get to see a movie about dudes flying it and playing volleyball.
The promo is so cringy, y'all. I don't recommend it. Obviously, actually, I feel like we've never talked about the Air Force van, which is funny because I feel like that is a big focus for my program, and especially my boss at Stimson. He thinks the Air Force shouldn't exist, so we should talk about that sometime.
Yeah,
so is my good buddy Rob Farley. He actually wrote a book.
We all agree about this.
Yeah.
Widespread agreement that the Air Force is a plague.
Yes.
But so why should people care about this? Well, the F-47 is well positioned to supersede the F-35 as the most expensive program in U.S. history. Time will tell. Can't wait to see what happens.
America, still great.
All right. Well,
still breaking new boundaries.
With that military graft, I guess we'll wrap it up here. Undiplomatic, I don't know, whatever. Okay. Just like us and subscribe to us, okay?
All right.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.